Larry Lohmann is an author and founding member of the Durban Group for Climate Justice and is sharing his experiences throughout the United States concerning the failure of carbon trading in Europe, India, Brazil, Uganda, and elsewhere, and is learning more about U.S. carbon trading plans and climate politics. In 2004, the Durban Group convened in Durban, South Africa to question the central role of carbon trading in official responses to the climate crisis. Since 1997, Lohmann has worked with the Corner House, a research and solidarity organization based in the UK. And during the 1980s, he lived and worked in Thailand, teaching and working with local environmental groups. Larry was telling me that he was trained in philosophy and had this overseas experience in Thailand, and it was there and subsequent to that experience that he's done his own self-education in environmental issues, which I think is an extraordinary achievement of the importance of self-learning. Over 350,000 copies of his latest book, Carbon Trading, A Critical Conversation on Privatization and Power from 2006 have been downloaded from the Internet. He is the co-author of Pulping the South, Industrial Tree Plantations and the Global Paper Economy. And I want to talk to him about that because I've been to Chile and seen their tree plantations there. And Whose Common Future, Reclaiming the Commons from 1993, and co-editor of The Struggle for Land and the Fate of the Forest. His articles on globalization, racism, environmental conflict, and discourses of population and neoclassical economics have appeared in journals such as Science as Culture, New Scientist, Asian Survey, and many others. He's received degrees from Cornell, Princeton, and has been a visiting fellow at Yale University. We will have until about 10 to the hour for this lecture, and I understand Larry's pretty flexible with how that will work. We welcome comments and questions, but we will need to be attentive to another group that's coming in at 1 o'clock. So without further ado, please welcome Larry Lohmann.
Okay, thanks very much, George. I guess this event was advertised as a lecture. Excuse my voice. I've been on the road for a while, and it's hard to keep going. But I really don't want this to be a lecture, so please, everybody, feel free to interrupt me at any point from the very beginning with questions or comments or objections or contributions of any kind. I have prepared a little slide presentation for today, but I'm happy to really go in any direction. And actually, I have several slide presentations that I can get pictures from, that I can get illustrations from if we want to go in a different direction, as long as I can work this technology here. So please feel free to interrupt. I thought I would start just by outlining some of the concerns that my colleagues and I have had about not only climate change, which, as everybody knows, is such a big problem facing all of us, but about some of the mainstream solutions to climate change that are being offered at the international level, at the national level, even the state level. Some of my colleagues actually, while they're extremely concerned about the climate crisis and the threat it poses to agriculture, to human life, to problems of disease, problems of survival, they're also just as concerned about some of these climate solutions that are emerging at the official level. My colleagues are from a lot of different countries. As George mentioned, I myself work in the UK, but in this Durban Group for Climate Justice, which formed recently out of concern about these problems, there are people from Indonesia and South Africa, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Brazil, Pakistan, many different countries who have come together and share some of the concerns about these mainstream approaches to climate change. So I think although I'll be presenting a slideshow that I have made myself, actually in the car coming here. It actually reflects a lot of sharing and a lot of thinking that comes from this whole group that I've been working with quite closely for many years about the climate problem. So I'll start without further ado. And I think maybe the best place to start is just to remind ourselves what the problem we're facing is actually all about. What is the climate problem? Seems like an obvious question. But it's actually not always discussed in the newspapers. It's not always discussed clearly on the news programs or even in textbooks. So just to review what the problem is about, it's really all about these two different kinds of carbon. You know, everybody knows that, well, carbon is carbon. All carbon is the same. But in terms of the climate problem, that's not really true. There are two pools of carbon. There's this big pool of carbon underneath the ground in fossil fuels. There's also other carbon underneath the ground in carbonate rocks, but we can leave that aside for now. There's the fossil fuel pool of carbon, and then there's this great big active carbon pool above the surface, which consists of oceans, forests, rocks, trees, fresh water, and of course the atmosphere. And the carbon in this active carbon pool above the ground is always circulating. The carbon is going into the atmosphere, it's coming out of the atmosphere into the trees, it's going back into the atmosphere, it's going into the oceans, making the oceans more acidic, and so forth. It's constantly circulating, and that's an important fact about it. But the problem is that there's so much fossil carbon is going into the atmosphere that it's accumulating there, although it's constantly circulating in and out of the atmosphere. So much is going into this above-ground carbon pool that does tend to accumulate in the atmosphere. And although the global warming problem is very complex, this is really the heart of it, is this transfer of fossil carbon into this above-ground system. And Tim Flannery, who's a biologist from Australia, I think puts it very well in a single sentence by saying that there's so much carbon in coal alone that if we actually bring it all out of the ground and burn it, it would make the planet hostile to life as we know it. That's actually quite a difficult statement to accept, because what it means is that most of the remaining fossil fuels are going to have to be left in the ground. That's just a fact. You know, when the presidents tell us, when the prime ministers tell us we're going to continue exploiting fossil fuels until the end, they're wrong. That can't happen. Most fossil fuels are going to have to stay exactly where they are. This just illustrates again that cycle. I mean, the problem, of course, is that the fossil fuels come out of the ground, and they do go back underground eventually, and more fossil fuels are formed, but in the time spans that we're concerned about, that's not terrifically useful for us because it takes so long for the fossil fuels to reform once they've come out of the ground. So basically, this is your problem, this black stuff coming through this pipeline into this great big above-ground system. And it would seem that the common sense solution is, in order to stop that happening, would be to put a cap in it, to try to stop it from coming out of the ground. Because it's just accumulating it's over-accumulating in the above-ground system. That's one aspect of the fossil fuel problem, is that these fossil fuels are going to have to stay in the ground. The other aspect is actually that this great above-ground carbon space, dumping space that everyone is using in the atmosphere, in the trees, and so forth. Well, actually, not all of us are overusing it. This overuse of this above-ground carbon pool to park our fossil carbon in is actually a problem. It's not everybody's problem. It's a problem caused by a minority of the world's population, mostly in the industrialized countries, not all, but mostly in the industrialized countries, mostly by certain industries, largely by ways of doing things, ways of organizing transport in the industrialized countries, ways of organizing energy consumption and production in the industrialized countries. This is the real, this is, politically speaking, this is also a key part of the problem. And I think Andrew Sims puts it very well when he says that the economic superpowers are actually occupying this great above-ground carbon cycling capacity that we work with. They're actually occupying it disproportionately, just as in colonial times, the colonial countries occupied land, occupied the terrestrial world disproportionately. And I think that's a second element of the political problem of climate change that it's always good to keep in mind. What does that suggest? That suggests that there can be different kinds of action to solve the problem. And just to mention two of the actions, I mean, we have this problem of overuse. We're overusing the above-ground carbon dump. Well, how do you deal with that? The sort of thinking person's obvious solution is to cut the extraction, to stop the extraction of fossil fuels. But of course, there's an alternative proposal, which is often put forward by very intelligent, clever people to say, well, maybe we can continue extracting fossil fuels, but somehow we can find new places to dump it in. And I'll be going into the problems with that view a little bit more later. Then, of course, there's the problem that this great carbon cycling capacity is being used unequally by the world's people. And once again, there are different approaches you can take to that. One approach at the bottom is, of course, to try to use the dump more wisely, more equitably, more fairly, more in tune with ideas of justice. The other approach above that is to simply entrench or reinforce the inequalities that exist through privatization, so that the big users of fossil fuels can continue to use a disproportionate amount of this great global good that we all supposedly share. This has led to a big problem in US politics, and I'm expressing it in a way here that you might not see expressed very often in newspapers or magazines or TV. But I think it's useful to look at it this way. I think this was a dilemma which was facing a lot of US political elites in the 1990s when they began to realize that public concern about climate change and the climate change problem itself were not going to go away. What are we going to do? Are we going to continue to occupy this global good, this global carbon cycling capacity? And in the US, that's a very relevant question, because although no one knows exactly what the size of this great global carbon dump is that we all use, it's probably fair to say that the US occupies a disproportionate amount of it. I mean, the US has maybe 4% of the world's population, but certainly they produce something like a quarter of the carbon dioxide emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that the world produces. And some people would say that, well, you know, in a very rough way, you could say that the US is already occupying all of the available carbon dumping space on the planet, technically leaving very little for anyone else. So what do you do with this if you're a US politician? It's quite a difficult problem. Do you want to just continue using this capacity, just go on with business as usual? Or do you want to accept some limits, make some concessions? Well, this was a big fight, actually, in the US. You know, what should we do? Should we go on business as usual, the sort of ExxonMobil kind of philosophy, which is still, I think, powerful today in the US? Or should we accept some limits? But maybe we can also turn this great global carbon dump into some kind of private property, and we can maintain some control over that using this legal mechanism of private property. And that way we can continue to use this disproportionately without too much change in the way we do business. In essence, I suppose you could say this is a conflict between companies like Exxon and companies like Enron. Exxon, of course, as you probably know, has been very negative about any approach to limiting carbon dioxide emissions. But Enron was very positive about a certain approach to dealing with the problem. Enron says, we would really like to have a treaty for carbon trading. We would like to be able to, we support the Kyoto Protocol, for example. The Kyoto Protocol is a trading treaty. Why? Well, we're traders. We know how, we have a big trading department. We're energy traders. We know how to deal with this kind of market. So Enron actually supported the Kyoto Protocol, and they got into a big fight with George Bush when George Bush said he didn't want to have anything to do with it. So this conflict actually was very real in US politics. This is a totally unfair slide, but I think it reflects that, you know, there's actually quite a narrow debate going on about this. I mean, everybody thinks that the debate in global warming is between anti-Kyoto and pro-Kyoto. But actually, no. The debate is actually much broader. We're given the impression that the debate is all between, you know, Exxon and Enron, or between George Bush and Al Gore, for example. But actually, these two guys are actually not that far apart when you look at it carefully. George Bush, of course, accepted eventually the Exxon type of position, and although Al Gore actually has many fewer personal connections with Enron than George Bush has. George Bush is much more close to them personally. I think it's fair to say that Al Gore represents a position which Enron would have liked, Enron would support. The Kyoto Protocol, carbon trading as an approach to global warming, privatization of the atmosphere as an approach to global warming. What I said about the Kyoto Protocol might seem a little surprising, but let me back it up with a statement from someone who should know, the Executive Secretary of the UN apparatus on climate change, Michael Zamet-Kutajar, who was there. And he said, yeah, the Kyoto Protocol was made in the USA, as well as the anti-Kyoto Protocol philosophy of George Bush. Both of these philosophies were made in the USA. The fight between pro-Kyoto and anti-Kyoto is actually really a bit of a factional dispute between different interest groups in the USA. What happened in Kyoto was that the US delegation showed up and said, yes, we can go forward with an international treaty on climate change, but we demand that it be turned into a trading treaty. We demand that the climate solution be all about forming a carbon market to buy and sell pollution rights. And if you, the rest of the world, agree to this, we'll try to sign the Kyoto Protocol. We'll get on with it. And it was late at night and the last day of the meetings and so forth. And the rest of the world accepted this in the end. And the Kyoto Protocol was written as a trading treaty, as an economic treaty, as a result. So what I'm going to be talking about actually is all about the Kyoto Protocol, as well as some of these other carbon trading solutions that you're going to be hearing a lot about in Utah and in other places over the next months. And I call it the privatization solution because if you're going to create a market to trade, you've got to have private property rights. You have to create private property rights in this great global good of the carbon cycling capacity of the earth so that you can buy and sell those rights. And there's two parts to this cap and trade, to this carbon trading solution. There's something called cap and trade, and then there's something called offsets. Has everybody heard of cap and trade? Yes, some nods, some doubtful faces. Carbon offsets? Has anybody not heard of carbon offsets? Okay. I'll go a little bit over these because it's important. Both of these are crucial parts of the mainstream privatization solution to carbon trading. And my thesis and the thesis of my colleagues is that both of these approaches are actually interfering with more constructive approaches. I don't want to go into these now, but just to mention that there are many other approaches out there on the table worldwide for dealing with climate change. And what I'm going to be talking about is simply the dominant one today, politically dominant one today, which is the privatization solution or carbon trading. And here are some of the other solutions. We can maybe come back to those later. The goal of the privatization solution or the carbon trading solution, and this goes for all kinds of pollution trading. There have been other kinds of pollution trading in the US in the past, in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s. The goal has always been not to achieve a structural change, for example, a change completely away from a fuel source, or a change in transport systems, or a change in the way we do business altogether. But the goal has always been to achieve certain fairly limited numerical emissions cuts and to offer industry some incentives for joining a pollution program. And those are two very different things. And I think that's important when we talk about climate change as a political problem, because climate change actually demands certain kinds of structural change. If, shockingly enough, we're going to have to leave most of the fossil fuels in the ground, which is a fact, then we're going to need structurally to change the way we organize our energy production and consumption. We're going to need structural change in our transport systems. We're going to need structural change even in our communities, in the way we think about how we relate to the earth, whether we really need this excessive dependence on fossil fuels in industrialized countries and so forth. We're talking about big things here. We're not talking about simply making a few percent reductions this year and maybe another percent next year and so forth. These are slightly different problems. And that's important to keep in mind looking at the details of carbon trade. So let's look quickly at this world of cap and trade. This is the theory behind cap and trade. And this is something which all markets have to do. Markets are all about making things the same so you can exchange them. And cap and trade, like all markets, is all about this equal sign. Making things equal so you can trade them. And the idea is this: okay, if you want to reduce your pollution to within this circle, or within this circle, you can do it in different ways. You can say, okay, this company has to cut X amount, this company has to cut Y amount, and it all has to add up to the circle. But maybe that's very expensive. Maybe this guy is a fossil fuel coal-fired electricity generator, and this guy simply cannot change over to a whole different way of production very easily because he has billions of dollars invested in, coal-fired power plants and so forth. But this person, maybe it's different. Maybe this person is able to reduce very easily. Maybe she's very clever about how to reduce emissions. Maybe she's not dependent on fossil fuels in the first place, so she can change it. She can change her way of doing things quite easily. And if that's the case, then why not make the whole thing cheaper for everybody? Let A continue to produce pollution, or even increase, and let B make all the cuts she can make, everything she can do. Maybe she can even cut to zero. And A can pay B to cut A's emissions for him. So B makes money. B gets paid by A to cut a lot of emissions. And A saves money because A doesn't have to reinvest in all this heavy fossil fuel or non-fossil fuel power plant. So everybody comes out ahead. And that's how cap and trade works. And if you present it this way, it's very beautiful, it's very neat, it's extremely ingenious, and it seems like no one could object to it. You achieve the same result, the same emissions cut, the same circle, but you do it cheaper. And so industry is happier, everybody's happier. What could be the problem? Well, the problem comes when you look a little further into what this implies. And I'm going to argue that actually, if you look at the details of this scheme, cap and trade actually delays transition away from fossil fuels. It actually selects against immediate investment in long-term structural change. It actually discourages the kind of structural change that's necessary. It can't be implemented yet due to measurement problems, involves other enforcement obstacles, and very crucially, it creates and hands out property rights to the biggest polluters in the north. And that has a lot to do with the problems of structural change. Since I do work in Europe, and I guess I should regard myself as a bit of a visitor from Europe, I just wanted to share a bit of the experience of what's happened there with this privatization approach, where these private property rights are created and handed out. What's happened in Europe is that the EU has accepted this cap and trade system. They've given out, to start the market off, they've given out pollution rights to the biggest corporate polluters in Europe so that they can trade them. And how many did they give out? Well, they said, okay, at the beginning, let's not be too strict. Let's give out a lot of pollution rights just to get the market started. And they asked the companies how much the companies were polluting so they'd know more or less where to begin making their reductions. And of course, the companies were not stupid, and they provided a lot of data showing that they were polluting quite a lot. So the governments handed out a lot of pollution rights to begin with to the companies. In fact, they handed out more pollution rights in the first phase of the scheme than the companies were actually polluting. So the market collapsed in April 2006 because there were so many pollution rights being out in the system. No one actually needed them very much. So everybody got very embarrassed in Europe, and they said, okay, well, we'll do it better next time. We won't be so credulous of the companies. We will try to impose serious limits on the number of pollution rights we hand out. And they're trying to do that. They're not getting very far because the companies are continuing to lobby for a lot of pollution rights, arguing that they won't be competitive if the government doesn't give them all the pollution rights they're asking for. But efforts are being made. This is a politically important column showing what's happened politically with this. In giving out all of these pollution rights, the European governments have given out, of course, rights to what is a global good, what is actually an atmospheric, oceanic, biotic system, which is interlinked, which takes care of the carbon that comes from fossil fuels. How much of this global dump have the European governments given to their corporations? Well, it's hard to say how much of this global dump is actually available, because that depends on what kind of world we want. It depends on a lot of scientific uncertainties. We can't specify how big the carbon dump we have to work with globally is with any precision or certainty. But if we take the findings of the scientists who advise the UN seriously, the size of this dump is something like between 20 and 40% of what we're using today globally. And if that's true, then what the European governments have given to their biggest polluting corporations is up to a third of the global carbon dump. Well, what's the population of Europe? I mean, I think you can figure it out for yourself that there are political questions here. What gave the European governments the right to give away free to their biggest corporations such a huge slice of a global good that we're all supposed to share and that we're all supposed to take care of? And of course, this global good does have a monetary value. It is an asset, financially speaking, accounting speaking. It's an asset. It's a giveaway. If the carbon price gets up to 30 euros a ton, for example, it amounts to a giveaway of 50 billion euros per year. And once again, the bulk of that is going to the biggest polluters, the biggest fossil fuel users. And not surprisingly, as a result, some of the biggest fossil fuel users in Europe, especially electricity companies, have made a lot of free money out of the system. And some of them are actually using that free money to invest in, guess what? More fossil fuels, more coal production. So with a great effort, we have to step back and ask ourselves, well, what is the system supposed to be doing? It's supposed to be getting us off fossil fuels. Yet in Europe so far, it's subsidizing the continued use of fossil fuels. And again, these are not my conclusions. Peter Atherton, who's a financial analyst, not the sort of person I usually would associate with, said this in a seminar last year, evaluating the European cap-and-trade system. He said, well, have policy goals been achieved? No. Prices are up, emissions are up, profits are up. The biggest winners are coal generators, nuclear, hedge funds, energy traders. The losers are consumers. These guys, who are long-time observers of climate politics, came out with a very clear statement a few months ago, just saying, the Kyoto Protocol, which is, basically a carbon trading scheme, was always the wrong tool for the nature of the job. As an instrument for achieving emissions reductions, it has failed. It's produced no demonstrable reductions in emissions or even in anticipated emissions growth. And we find even characters like George Soros coming out and saying, well, this isn't working, it's breaking down. And there are, of course, a lot of other press reports saying more or less the same thing. These price mechanisms are simply not addressing the problem. There are a lot of people out there making a lot of money out of carbon trading, but it's actually not working to deal with the problem. It's not encouraging meaningful investment in carbon-reducing technologies. And you might ask, well, how does that work? Because surely the system, this price system, should be giving some incentives, at least for the cleaner industries, to become cleaner, to innovate, to find non-fossil fuel ways of doing things, because it's going to be more expensive for them if they have to pay for pollution rights in the future, if the governments get serious about reducing the amount of pollution rights in circulation. Surely that'll create an incentive for at least some companies to get clever and find new ways of doing without fossil fuels. And that's true. The system does provide, in theory, some of those incentives. The problem is it also provides another set of incentives that go precisely to where the fossil fuels are being used most in the electricity generators, the cement industry, chemicals, iron and steel, and so forth. And these guys are getting incentives to continue business as usual because it'll be cheaper for them to buy emissions rights from other people. So the heart of the problem, which lies in these fossil fuel intensive industries, is actually not being affected. In fact, it's having a perverse effect on some of the industries that lie at the heart of the global warming problem. Okay, a few more quotations from Europe. And I think in the last year or so, a lot of people, a lot of economists and energy specialists who have been observing what's going on are coming to the same conclusion. Price of carbon is not having an effect. Governments are relying way too much on the price of carbon. It's a very poor weapon in what is supposed to be a war to save humanity. And he points out, Jim Watson at the Sussex University Energy Group, reminds us that, well, you know, the oil price shocks of the 1970s weren't able to get us off oil. Why do we think suddenly that price has changed into a magic mechanism which will get us off fossil fuels now? Okay. I want to move on quickly to the second part of the carbon market, which is these carbon offsets that some of you at least have heard about. And the theory here is, again, a theory which revolves around this equal sign, making things the same. The idea is that if you actually can't reduce your emissions, it's just as good to keep emitting, but do something to compensate for your emissions. For example, plant a lot of trees in some other country which will soak up your carbon dioxide. For example, set up some kind of energy-saving project in another country that will compensate for your emissions. For example, you could set up a windmill project in India, which supposedly displaces fossil fuel use in India. So less fossil fuels in India. You know, the atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon molecules are coming from. If you reduce carbon molecules in India, it's just as good environmentally as reducing carbon molecules at home. So you can continue polluting at home if you invest in some carbon saving project abroad. That's the theory of offsets. And offsets are providing new pollution rights to these guys, the guys who are polluting using fossil fuels at home. So the idea is that reduction is the same as an offset. And here's an advertisement from a private offset firms. By the way, you can buy these offsets for yourself personally if you want to. You know, under the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of industries in the industrialized countries are buying offsets through the United Nations market system. But there's also a private market system where you as an individual can buy carbon credits to offset your own fossil fuel production. And here's an advertisement from one of them in the US. You might have seen it. The idea is that, okay, you emit 6 tons. Well, invest in some offsets. And notice they call the offsets reductions. It's something strange has happened to the English language here, because you know what they're actually offering to sell you is not a reduction, it's an offset. It's a compensation. They're not actually reducing your emissions. They're doing something somewhere else which is supposed to compensate for those emissions. But the idea is that because these things are the same, the equal sign again, it all adds up to 0, so you're okay. And of course that, you know, if you take this to its logical conclusion, it means that, you know, you can continue to build more and more fossil fuel plants all over the world, and that's fine, as long as each one has a little offset attached to it. That might seem absurd, that'll never happen, but that is the logic of the system. And here's a sort of example of the philosophy behind tree offsets, where you pay someone else to plant a lot of trees for you to soak up the carbon that's coming out of the ground. And that's how that works sort of in diagrammatic fashion. And of course, you know, that provides a lot of extra pollution rights for the people who are polluting a lot already. And again, this is to share the experience of Europe. This is what's happened in Europe. The governments became very embarrassed when it was discovered that they were handing out so many pollution rights to their industry that the industry didn't even need them. They said, okay, we're going to reduce our cap, we're going to reduce our limit, overall limit on pollution. We're going to get serious with these companies and say they can't pollute so much. But at the same time, the governments allowed a lot of extra carbon pollution permits to come into the system from abroad, from offsets, from places like India and Brazil. And that, in effect, increased the cap at the same time the governments were claiming to the public that they were reducing the cap, because it provided licenses for both A and B to continue polluting if they wanted to. They could simply buy cheap pollution permits in from abroad. So that's what's happened. That's what happened with the offset system in Europe. It's combined with the cap and trade system to provide a whole lot of extra licenses to pollute for some of the worst industries. And once again, I can quote someone in the industry themselves saying that these offset credits actually exceed the shortage of carbon emissions permits within Europe, making it cheap for European firms to avoid cutting their own emissions at all. This was just an example of one company that's able to use offsets in order to continue business as usual. It's a big electricity generating company in Europe. I'll skip over that. It's not. I'd like now to talk about actually what's happening on the ground with some of these offset projects outside Europe. And I think this will raise again the question of, is privatization really a good environmental solution to this climate problem? This is an area outside Raipur, about 20 kilometers outside Raipur, which is the capital city of Chhattisgarh state, which some Indian colleagues and us visited last year. It's an area where a lot of the big Indian industrial groups have set up these enormous coal-fired sponge iron production plants. Using local iron ore, using local coal. It's very economical for them, and they've sprung up in order to produce iron for export to China for the Chinese Olympics. And as a result, you can see the air quality has suffered. The local people's crops have been damaged. Yields are way down. When we were there, we could even see if you rubbed the rice stalks or the rice leaves in your hands, the black stuff would come off on your hands. So a lot of villagers have to sell up their land. And of course, this is good for the companies because they can buy it up cheaply and expand their operations. The sponge iron plants are creating a lot of health problems. As you can see, it's even a sort of perpetual twilight in the area. They use a lot of groundwater. As you know, iron and steel is an industry that's very water intensive, so they're taking a lot of water away. And one village was so upset about this that when they found out that this plant was being constructed near their village, they actually blocked the road to the plant so that the company officials and owners and the government officials couldn't even get into the plant. And the plant lies idle. And well, here's one of the villagers who was helping to block the road. She was later arrested on a trumped-up charge of murder. Of course, the company fights back when something like this happens. This is sort of the standard kind of battle that goes on in a place like this. Well, you might ask, what is all this? Has all this to do with climate change? All of these companies, these sponge iron companies, and there are about 24 of them, are applying to be allowed to produce carbon credits to sell to us, to the industrialized countries, so that we can continue polluting. They can do that under the UN carbon market because they can say, okay, we are making our production a little bit more efficient. We're not closing down our factories, but we're making it more efficient so we don't pollute so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And some of these projects have actually passed through the regulation of the UN system. They are regarded as legitimate. So we find fossil fuel-fired power plants on one end of the world, in India, being supported by a market, and on the other end of the market, in Europe, fossil fuel industries are also being supported by the market. The Indian fossil fuel plants are benefiting, the European fossil fuel plants are benefiting, yet it's all taking place under the auspices of a program which is supposed to address global warming. And this sort of case is not unusual. In fact, it's representative of the kinds of carbon offsets that European companies and European nations are buying under this mainstream solution to climate change. And this, again, is creating a lot of scandals. And people are saying, you know, this is a disaster. Can we fix it or not? What can we do about this? And no one's come up with a really good answer. It's a statement from one of our colleagues who's very concerned about climate change, but he's equally concerned about some of these solutions which are being offered to climate change, which are affecting the same, they're affecting the same people who are going to suffer from climate change the most, with a sort of double whammy in terms of this mainstream solution. Here's just some pictures from the recent climate negotiations about some other people. These are indigenous people who are concerned about recent proposal, which is before the UN now, to use native forests or natural forests in countries like Indonesia as basically as carbon sinks for the industrialized North, as ways of allowing the industrialized North to continue business as usual. There's a Bali-style satirical poster in the background. I don't know if you can see it, but it's satirizing the idea of setting aside Indonesian forests for use as carbon sponges for the industrialized countries. Carbon markets, the convenient lie. Biofuels, of course, also a big issue. Biofuels are being proposed as a solution to climate change, and in some cases they're being proposed as something you could use in this trading system. And there's a lot of reaction against that among civil society movements in Indonesia. Another satirical poster, some more satire. Here's another example of a carbon offset project that uses trees in Uganda, and this is part of the private market. A Netherlands offset organization called the FACE Foundation has made a deal with the Uganda Wildlife Authority to plant eucalyptus trees on the boundary of a highly contested national park area where the villagers, the local villagers, and the government forestry officials are at loggerheads over the use of land. The local people say that the national park has stolen their land. The national park has been gazetted over their land. And of course, the government says, no, I mean, we have to establish this national park. You guys have got to leave. And shots have been fired, people have been injured, people have been killed. This is a long-standing dispute. But into the middle of this dispute comes the carbon market with this deal whereby trees are going to be planted in order to absorb carbon dioxide on the boundaries of this national park. And, well, here's a picture of some villagers who actually cut down those trees because they felt those trees were on their land, and they planted corn instead. Here's one of those trees. Here's a villager who actually has land title to the land that he's been deprived of, and he shows that title here. And one of the interesting features about these offsets, and this is true pretty much across the board in the global south, is that local people are not being informed about this carbon market, about the sources of money which are coming in and depriving them of their rights. Even a forestry official in Uganda said, we know nothing about this. We know nothing about this trade in CO2 and who's getting the money. This graph just shows, you know, where some of the carbon credits are coming from, what kind of projects they're coming from. The hope was originally that, you know, it would be renewable energy projects, you know, not tree plantation projects so much, and certainly not sponge iron projects in Chhattisgarh. The hope would be that the carbon market would help spur development of green energy in the global south. But that's actually not happened, at least so far. That just shows the project types. Instead, you know, as the sponge iron example suggests, the beneficiaries are actually some of the big industrialists in the south rather than people really working for renewable energy. I think I'll skip that. There are big problems with measuring how much carbon is saved by these offsets, but I think I'll skip that for the time being and try to wrap up, actually. Just some summary points about the problems with this mainstream solution to climate change, which we've gotten from our experience in Europe and in countries like Uganda and India. It's actually delaying the transition away from fossil fuels. It's actually blocking constructive approaches to climate change. it's providing new finance for corporate and state bad citizens in local areas. And a topic that I won't go into is the measurements are actually too difficult and actually can't support such a market. So I think I'll just wrap up there with what I have to say. If anyone wants more information, or if you want a free copy of the book, which came out in 2006, where we tried to compile a lesson so far from the privatization solution, you can get a free copy by writing to the email address at the bottom there. But I'll wrap up now, and I'm sorry I've taken too long, but if there are a couple of questions, we certainly have time to have a discussion. Yeah, in the back.
Just while you were talking, I got to thinking about if there would be a way to trap carbon before it goes into the atmosphere and put it back in the earth or wherever. So my friend here has a computer, so I looked it up and read that like people have done all this work on seeing what that would do and how much it would cost, and which was really, really interesting and nice to know. I had no idea that people were looking into that. Why? I mean, I understand from what I was reading that it takes energy to take the carbon and put it back in the earth, and so that would be hard for power companies and whatnot that use a lot of fossil fuels. But is there any other reason other than that? Like, what seems like that would work really nice?
Yeah, this is one of the big solutions being proposed actually by the energy industry today. It's called carbon capture and sequestration. The idea is that you can continue using fossil fuels, and through sort of technological means you can capture it and you can pump it back into disused oil wells or coal mines or geological formations where it'll be safe there. And this is really being pressed as one of the solutions, particularly in countries like the United States, but also in countries like Norway. There are a lot of questions about this. I mean, one of the questions revolves around the fact this is an untried technology. It's been experimented with a little bit, and the question is, do we want to believe that putting our emissions back in the ground is going to sequester them as safely as, for example, fossil fuels are sequestered in their natural geological formations? And I think the scientific consensus is not in on this, but I think there is a lot of skepticism about whether we want to gamble the entire future of the planet on a technology which we're not sure is actually going to be able to keep this very volatile substance underground through technological cleverness. Yes, in the yellow?
Yes, so you've obviously all been thinking about this, so what are your ideas? What direction do you think we're going?
I think we all have a lot of experience of directions that we need to be going in. I mean, in traveling around, I've been very impressed by a lot of the actions being taken at the regional level, the local level, the municipal level, for example, in the United States. I mean, like cities are getting together to talk about the long-term move away from carbon to become non-carbon cities. There's local groups. There's groups. There are groups who are trying to get us out of the Iraq War, which is basically an oil war. There are groups which are trying to pursue their own renewable energy strategies. There's lots of things going on at the local level, which I've been very impressed with. But there are also a lot of larger scale solutions that we actually already all know about, including regulation, including the shifting of subsidies away from fossil fuels and toward renewables, massive public investment in new ways of organizing energy and new ways of organizing our transport system, recognition and support for local initiatives that already do exist, and they exist in all countries, in India and Brazil, as well as the US and Europe, for working toward a low-carbon fossil economy. Most of these local initiatives now are not supported by the big guys, by the United Nations, by national governments, and so forth. But I think what is needed is more of a movement to get governments to support these positive alternatives rather than attacking them. Taxation also has a place. I mean, you might realize from my presentation that I have a lot of doubts about how big a role price mechanisms can play in getting us toward the structural change that's necessary. And I am skeptical about taxes if they were used as a single instrument, because I think taxes might be useful to help us choose between different things, as long as we've got a choice, as long as some alternative has been developed, which will give us, which is available to us, that we can turn to when we find out that we're taxed out of some other alternative. So I think even taxes do have a role, although it's a role which depends on a lot of other things, like public investment, like shifting of subsidies away from fossil fuels, and so forth. So I think we all know actually a lot of other things that can be done, and a lot of people are already working very actively and constructively on that.
Probably the last question real quick. And
You talked primarily about like carbon trade and ways to regulate fossil fuel emissions. I was wondering if you could comment briefly on alternative energy sources, and especially like your opinion on nuclear power and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and this is becoming really dangerous in Europe, like in the country I live in the UK, is the government is beginning to press for a renaissance of nuclear power using the climate change justification, using the claim that nuclear power is a low carbon source. And I think this is really dangerous. I mean, I think nuclear power has, there are devastating objections to the use of nuclear power to deal with the energy problems. I mean, there's the problem of waste, there's a problem of uncertainty, there's a problem of the inherent political dangers of having these kinds of fuels around, all sorts of problems connected with nuclear, which actually make them a pretty bad choice for dealing with the problem. I would be more interested in approaches which question the need to have something which is just like fossil fuels. I think one thing the fossil fuel economy has taught us, and has taught people who have been fighting the fossil fuel economy for long before the climate change problem came along, is that it's a system which is very centralized. It requires a global system of exploitation, of land seizures, of takeover of forest areas, of takeovers of tundra in Alaska, and so forth. I think there are a lot of questions which are not being raised, that actually can be raised about the need for fossil fuels, the need for nuclear, and so forth. And I think these questions have to be addressed at the same time as we address the questions of alternative sources. I mean, we always have to ask the question, in my view, well, sources for what? We can also examine the need that makes us tempted by these false solutions or obsolete solutions like nuclear energy.